Alright, so I'm sure that over the last couple of days you guys have heard at least something about the absolutely insane stories that have been coming out about Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas and his connection, his corrupt connection, to a well-known GOP backing billionaire. So this story honestly has so many different layers that each get more interesting as we go on. So I'm going to start here with this ProPublica report that sort of launched off this entire controversy, but just stay with me here for a second because this shit gets to very weird and strange places really quickly. Okay, so here from ProPublica, they say for over 20 years, Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas has been treated to luxury vacations by billionaire Republican donor Harlan Crow, who, as many people have been pointing out, literally sounds like a Batman villain. Okay, so we get a little intro here. We've got the super yachts that Clarence Thomas was going on. We have him flying on a private jet, going to these different resorts and lake houses and all of these different things, where this billionaire has essentially been giving him free gifts that Clarence Thomas did not report, as he is supposed to be required to do. So they say Clarence Thomas and the billionaire. In late June of 2019, right after the U.S. Supreme Court released its final opinion of the term, Justice Clarence Thomas boarded a large private jet headed to Indonesia. He and his wife, who is absolutely insane, like a full-blown QAnon nut, okay, he and his wife boarded this private jet to Indonesia, and they were going on a vacation. 9 days of island hopping in a volcanic archipelago on a super yacht staffed by a coterie of attendants and a private chef. Did they pay for this themselves? No, they did not. They say if Thomas had chartered the plane and the 162-foot yacht himself, the total cost of the trip would have exceeded $500,000. They say, fortunately for him, that wasn't necessary because he was on a vacation with real estate magnate and Republican megadonor Harlan Crow, who owned the jet and the yacht too. Okay, so already we're running into trouble here, right? You, as a Supreme Court justice, member, we obviously know the corruption that is baked within how these Supreme Court justices get elected or get put in these positions in the first place, right? All of the people who Trump appointed, they all came from the Federalist Society. They all came from these conservative-backed groups. We understand all of that, but this is just like surface-level corruption. Like you are literally accepting gifts or bribes in some sense, if you want to go to that territory, from a well-known GOP megadonor, okay, a billionaire, and you're taking trips that are like not even like, oh, I went to my friend's lake house for a weekend with my family and we're just close friends, so we had some fun. No, you're going on $500,000 trips, okay, on a super yacht and on a private jet. Okay, keep in mind, his salary is only like a couple $100,000. These are not trips that he would have been able to go on otherwise in this fashion, but they say for more than 2 decades, Thomas has accepted luxury trips virtually every year from the Dallas businessman without disclosing them. And they say documents and interviews show a public servant who has a salary of $285,000, so basically double his salary, was spent on his behalf on just that one vacation that they took. They say he has vacationed on Crow's super yacht around the globe. He flies on Crow's Bombardier Global 5000 jet. He has gone with Crow to the Bohemian Grove, the exclusive California all-male retreat, and to Crow's sprawling ranch in East Texas. And Thomas typically spends about a week every summer at Crow's private resort in the Adirondacks. And they say the extent and frequency of Crow's apparent gifts to Thomas have no known precedent in the modern history of the U.S. Supreme Court. Okay, again, we understand the flaws with the Supreme Court structurally, just at a fundamental level. We understand the corrupt and political influences that go into these supposed like neutral arbiters of the Constitution. We get all that, but this is like somehow unprecedented, even with that baseline of corruption that we're all already aware of. They say these trips appeared nowhere on Thomas's financial disclosures. His failure to report the flights appears to violate a law passed after Watergate that requires justices, judges, members of Congress, and federal officials to disclose most gifts, 2 ethical law experts said. And he also should have disclosed the trips on the yacht, the experts said. Okay, so again, you're not only engaging in this sort of surface level corruption, you're also just like hiding it from the public, okay? Adding another level of, an egregious nature to this on top of it. But they say federal judges sit in a unique position of public trust. They have a lifetime tenure, a privilege that is intended to insulate them from the pressures and potential corruption of politics, which again is just absolutely hilarious. This idea that like, oh, we need lifetime appointments so that these justices don't feel political pressure. They are all political actors, okay? Whether they're liberals, whether they're conservatives, especially recently, much more conservatives. I mean, we've seen how many just openly political decisions that have nothing to do with legality or constitutionality or anything like that. They just make decisions based on what their own personal interpretation is of the Constitution. They do post hoc justifications of the decisions that they make. They're not some sort of god, okay? They're not some sort of like actual interpreter of the Constitution in a neutral and apolitical way. They are all political actors, but they love to just pretend as if like giving them this lifetime tenure is going to somehow prevent that from happening. I mean, it's just completely ridiculous. They say a code of conduct for federal judges below the Supreme Court requires them to avoid even the appearance of impropriety. Members of the High Court, the Supreme Court, Chief Justice John Roberts has written consult that code for guidance. And they say the Supreme Court is left almost entirely to police itself. So somehow we have like different standards for the highest court in the entire country that makes, drastically important decisions like the overturning of Roe v. Wade, tons of different decisions in regards to businesses and regulations and things that directly materially impact the lives of millions and millions of people. And apparently they're just like above a real code of ethics that is binding and like legally enforceable that even some other lower level justices would have applied to them in a similar context. I mean, it's just completely ridiculous. Obviously that would be like step one. You would need some sort of like an enforceable code of ethics for these guys. But they say there are few restrictions on what gifts justices can accept. That's in contrast to other branches of government, and they say members of Congress are generally prohibited from taking gifts worth $50 or more. He took a $500,000 trip with this Harlan Crow guy, okay? Members of Congress can't take a direct gift of $50 or more and would need pre-approval from an ethics committee to take many of the trips that Thomas has accepted from Crow. They say Thomas's approach to ethics has already attracted public attention, and again, of course, giving into the whims of his QAnon wife. They say last year, Thomas didn't recuse himself from cases that touched on the involvement of his wife, Ginny Thomas, in efforts to overturn the 2020 presidential election. And while his decision generated outcry, it could not be appealed. I mean, again, just amazing, okay? A guy who like has direct conflict of interest with that case to overturn the democratic will of the people in 2020 didn't even bother to recuse himself, or there's no potential like jeopardy there for a SCOTUS member who doesn't reveal that information or who doesn't recuse themselves. I mean, it's just a completely broken institution here. But they say that Crow met Thomas after he became a justice, and the pair have become genuine friends. Okay, that might be the case. You might be buddies with this guy. You might, have your families that are intertwined with each other in some way, shape, or form. That doesn't remove the corruption, okay? That's a completely separate question here. But they say over the years, some details of Crow's relationship with the Thomases have emerged. In 2011, the New York Times reported on Crow's generosity toward the justice. That's one way to put it. That same year, Politico revealed that Crow had given $500,000 to a Tea Party group founded by Ginny Thomas, which also paid her a $120,000 salary. But the full scale of Crow's benefactions have never been revealed. Okay, so again, it's a hyper-political billionaire actor that we're talking about here. It's not just some friend who doesn't really get involved in politics and they just hang out sometimes at resorts. No, this billionaire, Harlan Crow, is directly involved in trying to lobby for an agenda that is going to benefit his right-wing, social positions and his right-wing economic positions as well. So you can't detach those things and pretend as if these are just two friends having a good time. No, obviously that's going to have some degree of an impact. Now, it also may be the case that Clarence Thomas just happens to ideologically agree with this guy on basically everything. That might be the case, but again, we're talking about a guy who has previously come out and said how worried he is about trust eroding in our precious American institutions, okay? If you're so worried about that, maybe you would try to, prevent even the appearance of just rank corruption like this. But they continue. saying, long an influential figure in pro-business conservative politics, Harlan Crow has spent millions on ideological efforts to shape the law and the judiciary. Crow and his firm have not yet had a case directly before the Supreme Court since Thomas joined it, though the court periodically hears major cases that directly impact the real estate industry, which is where Harlan Crow made most of his money. They say the details of his discussions with Thomas over the years remain unknown, and it is unclear if Crow has had any influences on the justice's views. Yeah, I wonder if there's a connection there, right? They say in Thomas's public appearances over the years, he has presented himself as an everyman with modest taste. Okay, this is where we get to an even more entertaining portion of this, okay? Clarence Thomas, the guy who is going on $500,000 trips, okay, across the world on super yachts and private jets, this is how he wants himself to be perceived from the outside. He said, quote, "I don't have any problem with going to Europe, but I prefer the United States, and I prefer seeing the regular parts of the United States," Thomas said in a recent interview for a documentary about his life, which Crow helped to finance. And this is where it gets good. He says, "I prefer the RV parks. I prefer the Walmart parking lots to the beaches and things like that. So why weren't you just hanging out in a Walmart parking lot instead of going on these $500,000 trips?" I mean, it's just amazing, okay? He says, "There's something normal to me about it. I come from regular stock and I prefer that. I prefer being around that," okay? Let's just pause and appreciate that Clarence Thomas thinks like the ideal situation for, I guess, regular average Americans is hanging out in a Walmart parking lot. What does that even mean? Genuinely, like, what the fuck does that even mean? I prefer the Walmart parking lots to the beaches and things like that. What? I mean, it's amazing, okay? I don't even know what more I can say about that aspect of it. It's just absolutely amazing, okay? But they continue here saying that Crow's access to the justice extends to anyone the businessman chooses to invite along. Okay, so it's not just Harlan Crow who could potentially have undue influence over the decisions that Clarence Thomas is making at any given time. It's also some of the people who are going along on some of these trips with him, which, you'll see here is a problem in a minute. They say Thomas's frequent vacations at Topridge have brought him into contact with corporate executives and political activists. I wonder if there's a connection between him hanging out with top-level rich corporate executives and some of the pro-corporate decisions that he makes for the court. They say during just one trip in July of 2017, Thomas's fellow guests included executives at Verizon and PricewaterhouseCoopers, major Republican donors, and one of the leaders of the American Enterprise Institute, a pro-business conservative think tank, according to records reviewed by ProPublica. The painting of Thomas, which they showed up there above, at Topridge shows him in conversation with Leonard Leo, the Federalist Society leader, regardless as an architect of the Supreme Court's recent term to the right. And again, every single person who Donald Trump nominated to the Supreme Court came from a Federalist Society background, okay? These are the people who Clarence Thomas is just casually hanging out with as if it's not a problem at all, okay? They say, in his statement to ProPublica, Crow said that, quote, "He is unaware of any of our friends ever lobbying or seeking to influence Justice Thomas on any case, and I would never invite anyone who I believe had any intention of..." I mean, listen, you can't get a more laughable denial than that, right? Oh, it's just a coincidence that he's hanging out with all of these corporate executives and then legislating on behalf of those corporate executives. Oh, there's no connection there, right? I would never dare to even invite somebody who could possibly be trying to influence the decisions that Clarence Thomas is making on behalf of the American people. I mean, it's again, just amazing, okay? They say Crow has had deep connections in conservative politics. The heir to a real estate fortune, Crow oversees his family business empire and recently named Marxism as his greatest fear. He was an early patron of the powerful anti-tax group Club for Growth and has been on the board of AEI for over 25 years. He also sits on the board of the Hoover Institution, another conservative think tank. They say a major Republican donor for decades, Crow has given more than $10 million in publicly disclosed political contributions, which doesn't even tap into the non-publicly disclosed contributions that he has given. They say he's also given to groups that keep their donors secret. How much of this so-called dark money he's given and to whom are not fully known. Great campaign finance system that we have going on here in the United States, where some right-wing activist billionaire can just funnel money into campaigns without anybody knowing where it's going doing, what the impact is, who he's funding, any of that. I mean, it's just, again, this is like criminal behavior. This is what should be considered in a functioning democratic society, straight up criminal bribery and, undue influence like that, right? But we're going to finish here. They say, Crow has long supported efforts to move the judiciary to the right. He has donated to the Federalist Society and given millions of dollars to groups dedicated to tort reform and conservative Jewish jurisprudence. AEI and the Hoover Institution publish scholarships advancing conservative legal theories, and fellows at the think tanks occasionally file amicus briefs with the Supreme Court. Okay, so again, I don't know how you could get more brazen, in-your-face corruption than this. I mean, he's hanging out with these top-level executives, chilling here, smoking a cigar in front of some like weird statue that's like inexplicably in the background. He's hanging out with right-wing activists, right-wing billionaires, mega donors to the GOP. I mean, it's just brazen corruption for anybody, especially somebody who wants to, pretend as if he cares about the respectability of these institutions, okay? You see stories like this from ProPublica, and then you turn around and you're like baffled at the fact that the American people don't trust the decisions coming out of your institution, okay? I mean, it's, again, just completely ridiculous. But that's not even, the bulk of it, okay? That was the main part in terms of just the abject corruption that we're seeing on display. Now we get to an even more bizarre aspect of this story, because apparently this guy, Harlan Crow, is like a huge Nazi memorabilia collector, okay? This part of the story is just absolutely bizarre. So they say here from the Rolling Stone, following the news of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas's unethical friendship with GOP mega donor Harlan Crow, more details about the Texas real estate mogul have emerged, including a report that Crow is an avid collector of Adolf Hitler items. They say the Washingtonian on Friday resurfaced a 2014 article by the Dallas Morning News, where a tour of Crow's Dallas area mansion revealed the billionaire's historical collections includes a startling amount of Nazi memorabilia, including a copy of Mein Kampf signed by the author himself. The author in question is Adolf Hitler. He has a signed copy of Mein Kampf. What is going on here, right? They say he also has a pair of the failed artist turned dictator's cityscape paintings and Nazi medallions, swastika embossed linens, and more. Okay, now I've seen some conservatives who've been pushing back against this, and they're like, okay, well, that doesn't mean he's a Nazi. Okay, maybe, collecting historical artifacts, that doesn't necessarily mean that you are like a literal neo-Nazi or something like that, but this is just bizarre, man. I mean, it's bizarre behavior. I saw Ben Shapiro, he put out a video where he was basically saying like, well, of course somebody would want this stuff in their house. Okay, keep in mind, Ben Shapiro, the guy who's calling people who support Palestinian human rights anti-Semitic, he's making excuses for somebody who is like a massive collector of Nazi memorabilia. But basically his argument was like, well, we like to include things in our house like this in order to remind ourselves about some of the horrors that humanity has been responsible for. And it's like, really? Is that what's going on here? I mean, the thing that everybody famously loves doing, filling their house with shit that they absolutely despise. I mean, I think you could figure out some ways to remind yourself of the horrors of World War II and, Nazism without collecting like Hitler's handkerchief and a signed copy of Mein Kampf. It seems like you're just like flexing those items, or that you might enjoy having those items around for one reason, one way or another. I mean, I don't know what his motivation for this is. Maybe he's just a really weird guy, but it's definitely a super bizarre detail to this story, right? But they say while Crow was reluctant in this interview to discuss his collection with the Dallas Morning News at the time, he did make sure to note that he did not commission the dictator's statues. Rather, they were actual monuments that resided in public squares of the dictator's countries until they were toppled by citizens at the end of their regime. So apparently he also has this, I guess I skipped over this part, he also has this like Garden of Evil where he has statues of like, Yugoslav dictator Joseph Tito and, Stalin and Lenin and all of that stuff. But that's like in like a separate section that's like in this Garden of Evil, and then all of his like Hitler memorabilia and Nazi artifacts that he has are like in a different place that's kind of closer to other people who you would presume that he has a lot of respect for, like Winston Churchill and George W. Bush. So we're gonna get to that here in a second, but just keep that in mind here, okay? He has this weird like outdoor collection of statues, right? But they say The statues were then smuggled out of their respective countries, with Crow purchasing them to construct a garden oasis dedicated to man's inhumanity to man, as the Dallas Morning News wrote. Okay, so kind of like a quick question here. Why do you have this shit if you're like then going to hide it when you do an interview like this, right? He's kind of like, it seems like he's trying to like keep this off to the side, a little bit secretive, that he has all of this Nazi shit within his residence. Why would you be hiding that if you're doing this to proudly display the horrors of humanity? It seems like you'd be able to just, come forward and actually just explain that in detail instead of just like hiding it off to the side as if it's something you don't want people to know that you have, right? But they finish here saying that while Crow's vast historical collection does boast plenty of impressive items, like signed documents by George Washington and Christopher Columbus, a Winston Churchill statue, Monet paintings, and other noteworthy non-fascist things, I don't know if some of those things are non-fascist, but okay, we'll accept that for now if you're comparing them directly to Adolf Hitler, although Christopher Columbus, I think, was also a genocidal maniac, and, these other two guys have their problems as well. But they say strolling through Crow's gallery could be a bit jarring, as the newspaper wrote when gazing at the wall of Crow's home, paintings by Norman Rockwell and George W. Bush are adjacent to those done by Hitler. Again, kind of weird for somebody who is presumably a big fan of George W. Bush but hates Hitler to have those things sort of like side by side as if they're like, I don't know, equivalent in some way in your mind. Okay, so this is kind of a distraction in some ways from the core of the story here, which is again Clarence Thomas' brazen corruption that he has put on display here, impeachable corruption that I'll get to here in a second. But I mean, this is just a part of the story you just can't gloss over because it's just so weird and bizarre and strange that this is something that this guy has just chilling in his house. But so now we get to this aspect of it. So Clarence Thomas obviously came out, he tried to defend his trips, and he did it in just a ridiculous way. So they say here from the BBC, Supreme Court justices are required to file annual disclosures of gifts. Justice Thomas said that he had been led to believe that this sort of personal hospitality did not apply. $500,000 trips on super yachts and private jets. That's just casual hospitality. Don't we all do that for our friends, right? I mean, that's nothing out of the ordinary. Definitely don't need to report those things, right, as you are required to do. But they say in a statement on Friday, Justice Thomas said that he had sought guidance from my colleagues and others in the judiciary and was told that this sort of personal hospitality from close personal friends who did not have business before the court was not reportable. Okay, again, the idea that this guy does not have business before the court, what are you talking about? He's a billionaire, okay? Of course he does, in one way, shape, or form. There might not directly be some, piece of legislation or some court proceeding that's coming before the court that's like directly impacting the real estate markets, like in a firm way, but that doesn't mean that he doesn't have an agenda before the Supreme Court, right? And being ideologically close buddies with while taking these massive $100,000 gifts from people like Harlan Crow, a well-known political player and a GOP mega donor, that's corruption. I mean, there's nothing else to call that. You can't just brush that off as a close personal friend giving you a hand up and just like move on with your day. At the very bare minimum, you should have been reporting this stuff, which he just didn't, and just, I guess, is, going with the line that like, I did my best. I just didn't think that this applied. These $500,000 luxury trips around the world. And of course, in addition to him pathetically trying to defend himself, we also, as pointed out here by Andrew Perez of The Lever, we also have some paid pundits who are also aligned and in many ways financially connected to Harlan Crow, who are coming out and of course doing their little bootlicking tap dance in order to try to defend Clarence Thomas. On the flip side of that, we do have some people who are actually calling and trying to push forward with potential measures to remove him from the highest court in the entire fucking country. We have AOC here calling for Justice Clarence Thomas trips a very serious problem that warrants impeachment. So, I mean, listen, at the end of the day, yeah, he obviously deserves to be impeached. I mean, I think you could have made an argument that that court decision on the 2020 election, that in and of itself and his corrupt ties to that case could have been enough to impeach him. But, I mean, this shit, listen, if you, especially as somebody like Clarence Thomas, who's come out and said you're so worried about the respect and the trust in our sacred institutions in this country, if you believe that, you would step down, right? Because I mean, this type of shit, even if you don't want to say that it's like directly a bribe or something like this, I mean, this at least is doing more to erode the court than almost anything else. I mean, in addition to all of these other horrific pro-corporate and anti-choice decisions that the court has been handing down, I mean, this shit is just absolutely ridiculous, and Clarence Thomas absolutely deserves to be impeached for it.
Everyone is saying good politic guy has the best politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me. Everyone is saying